I had an article that was kind of a follow-up to this, but from a different source. It was an NPR article called "Small Business Loan Site Crashes on First Day of Funding." So I just get a kick out of the idea of, like, I guess not a kick, but I mean, there was all these challenges. They make all these changes. They come out with a new system that's supposed to help the second round go better, and then it's plagued with its own set of problems. And so a lot of the complaints were that the site that they used, the SBA site called eTran, wasn't allowing them to submit applications. There was a bunch of banks that said they had like 13 loan apps and they could only get one to go through the whole day while having their whole staff like just trying and refreshing. And then the article also talked about how the banks had gotten criticism for having received 10 billion in processing fees for the big banks in relation to issuing out these loans. And I guess I got kind of a kick out of that just because it's interesting that I may be wrong, but I think that the payroll or the processing fee that the banks got was also mandated by the legislation, and so it's controlled. And so again, it's not a valid point for criticism if it's built into the rules. And then the second thing is, like, to think about the processing fee in relation to, to say that 10 billion is too much of a processing fee. I think that that's not enough of a statement. Everything has to be scaled back to what exactly happened and what is 10 billion as a percentage of the total funds that were given. And also, can we really say what the correct percentage is? Do we really have a good grasp of what is a adequate processing fee for a loan like this, given that we, as spectators, don't know everything that goes into it? And so I guess I wanted to get you guys' take on whether or not 10 billion in processing fees is controversial for a loan of this type in a circumstance like this.
Charlie, this speaks kind of what I mentioned in the first article, that I think the context of this meaning is skewed when you just throw out a number like $10 billion, because that sounds large and astronomical to anybody. And they're like, why does banks need 10 billion more dollars? They make millions of dollars every minute. But I think if you look at it from a context of like a commission on a loan or something like that, you have to take that 10 billion into context of 10 billion of how much, what percentage is the bank taking in. And I think if you knew the full context of that number, it would probably sound a little more reasonable than just $10 billion. And I think it's the difference between the public, like having an idea, words being inflammatory or having like a clickbait message to them. I think 10 billion sounds a lot better than whatever the percentage is, right, that the banks are getting. So.
Yeah. Totally. And the other thing I thought about is, as I was just reading that quote, was that, I mean, the money going to banks isn't inherently a bad thing either. I mean, if it's not in this form, then is it not true that those banks will eventually be bailed out if they aren't, getting what they believe, what they need to operate, basically? And so I kind of read it as like, yeah, we can give it to them in a processing fee and have it be useful, or we can not, and then give it to them anyway in another form, And so, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I'm on the same page with you guys. I mean, that just throwing that number out there like that, it feels like clickbait more than being meaningful without more context.
And I have to go back to the first article. I know I'm going to get on my auditor soapbox here, but when they're talking about being audited for these, or the SBA doing an audit or a review of what's going on here, it's unclear what type of audit they're doing. For the general public to know, an audit isn't going to tell you where every penny got spent, or it's not going to ensure that all the rules and regulations were followed to a T. It's going to give you reasonable assurance. So what that means is they're going to look at a bulk of the transactions that happen that are material above a certain dollar threshold, and they're going to render an opinion on how that money was handled. It's not, I think, what the public thinks of, like when they think of an IRS audit or a forensic audit or any of those other kinds of audits that are done. I think specifically when you're talking about, auditing for a loan or something like that, you're talking about a fiscal audit or a compliance audit. And those things are very different, I think, from what the public knows or conceives in the word audit. And so I think that's something to keep in mind when they throw out, like all these loans are going to get audited, and what that means really means.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely, it was an example of them throwing out something that sounded good, but actually when you dig into it really doesn't mean anything, right? So, when Mnuchin says we're going to have these things completely audited, he's not using, he's presumably, I don't think he's using the term they're going to be audited in the accountant's sense. They're going to be audited. He's not saying, oh, they're going to follow professional standards of auditing and they're going to kind of do any of the things that you might expect if you were from a professional standpoint as accountant saying that there was going to be an actual audit. It's just that layman's use of the term audit, and he actually used it interchangeably with audit, and then later he said asking the SBA to do a full review. So, there's no there's no expectation from my perspective right now that phrase that these are going to be completely audited actually means anything. We don't know what it means. It's one of those things that sounds good, but you don't know what it means until they actually get into the details of what exactly they're going to do.
Well,
and who's going to do it.
Right.
In this case, because we had guidance that was published and then had the guidance change as we were trying to understand it. And so I think that when I think about what an audit would look like in this case, I would want to see just a performance of the rules. Just somebody checking to see that this person understood what their payroll costs entailed. And because there are a lot of little finer points for confusion as you try to interpret those rules in good faith. And so
Yeah, I think for sure it's going to revolve around who they ask to do this review or audit or whatever they ultimately call it, and how much budget they have, right? And that's how much budget in terms of dollars and time they can spend on it. Because if they basically put it in the SBA's camp and they have a limited budget to actually do these reviews, they're going to come up with a set of procedures that they perform on their own that may or may not really get to the bottom of what they're asking anyway.
Totally. And if you think you were mad about the processing fees for people issuing the loans, wait till you see the audit fees for people trying to verify that people actually did the loans correctly, because they're going to be bigger than the processing fees.
Yeah. Well, there was, we don't have all the information, so I hesitate to even bring this up, but on those lines, there was an article that I saw where Congress had authorized an increase to the Inspector General's office for the purpose of reviewing whether the funds granted under the CARE Act in totality were being spent as intended. And it said something about how that office had like 92 auditors, and they increased their budget, and I don't remember what the number was. They increased their budget sizably. The Inspector General's office said, well, they didn't expect that necessarily meant they were going to be bringing on a lot more auditors. But yeah, I thought about it, and I thought, well, 92 auditors sounds like a lot, but when you're talking on a nationwide program and really determining whether that money is being spent the way Congress intended, to me, it'd probably take way more than 92 auditors. You'd be probably talking in the thousands of auditors to really make that kind of determination. But I don't know. I've never been in the business of auditing. Those government auditors that do that kind of thing, they're pretty good at kind of figuring this stuff out and reporting back to Congress on a lot of things. So who knows?